Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Shoulders Down. I want to start off today's episode with a story that happened a few years ago, maybe like a year and a half or 2 years ago, when I was on a discovery call with a potential client who actually ended up becoming a client for my one-to-one coaching program, The Embodied Method. So, when we were on this discovery call, I asked a question that I often ask in discovery calls, which is why now? What made you fill out this application and consider getting serious support on your relationship with food and body now? It's always really interesting to me to hear what that needle mover moment was for someone to bring them over the line to actually fill out the application, take action, and apply. So when I asked this potential client that I'm referencing in this story, we'll call her R for the sake of keeping her privacy and keeping her anonymous. When I asked R this question, she shared how she had recently returned from visiting a friend in another state, and she felt so gross from eating past comfortable fullness the entire trip. She shared how her rock bottom moment on the trip was the last night of the trip when she found herself sneaking into the kitchen after her friend had gone to sleep and eating leftovers with the lights off. She explained how, though eating past comfortable fullness was somewhat of a constant struggle for her, visiting friends, going on trips, and really doing anything outside of her normal routine was especially triggering. If you're listening to this, I wonder if you can relate. Are you more likely to eat past comfortable fullness when you're eating out or traveling or hosting or doing something that's outside of your typical routine? I certainly used to have heightened episodes of binge eating when I was out of my typical routine or, in someone else's kitchen, like babysitting, raiding the family's pantry, at a friend's house, or at a holiday meal, or when traveling. All of those things used to be big triggers for me, and I'll get a little bit more into my story later in this episode. Feeling shitty from overeating is not fun, especially when you're trying to be present and enjoy the company of a loved one or the experience traveling. In this episode today, we're going to talk about why overeating when traveling or doing anything off your normal routine happens in the first place. I'll share a little bit more about my personal experience going through this when I was struggling with disordered eating. And then I'll go over the number one tip for how to stop this uncomfortable pattern of eating past fullness, specifically when traveling or doing things that are out of your typical routine. But before I go any further, I want to let you know about a workshop that I'm teaching on October 22nd called Overcoming Overeating. This episode will touch on overcoming overeating in the scenario when traveling, but the workshop touches on so much more and goes even deeper into specific tips and tools for how to overcome overeating. And some of the other topics we'll dive into in the workshop are how to stop emotional eating or how to get a hold on emotional eating, how to deal with nighttime snacking, and overall breaking that binge restrict cycle. So the workshop is on October 22nd at 4 p.m. Pacific, which is 7 p.m. Eastern. And you can convert that to whatever time zone you're in. Or if you can't attend live, you can join us still by enrolling, and then you'll get the replay of the recording of the workshop. Also, if you're listening to this in the future, you can still head to the link in the show notes and purchase the replay. If you are someone who struggles with overeating, then you can head to the link in the show notes. I'd love to have you in this workshop. And if you use code podcast at checkout, you can get the workshop for just $10, which is honestly such a steal for the amount of tools and support you're going to be getting in this workshop. Let's dive in to today's topic. So, as I said, we're going to start with answering the question of why does this happen? Why are we more likely to eat past comfortable fullness or binge when traveling or when hosting a friend or when at a holiday meal or doing something that's out of our typical routine? There could be a few things happening here, but the most common reason by far that you might be eating past comfortable fullness when traveling is the Last Supper mentality. The reason it's so common to have more frequent episodes of overeating in these situations is because your brain is trying to capitalize on the event, whether that event is traveling or going out at a restaurant or having a holiday meal or going to a birthday party or whatever it is. Your brain is trying to capitalize on that event as a socially acceptable excuse to eat your favorite foods, the foods that you're really desiring, but either consciously or unconsciously prohibiting yourself from having in your regular day-to-day life. Your brain, on some level, is thinking, okay, we're usually not allowed to have XYZ food, cookies, cake, chips, ice cream, candy, whatever. So we better gorge ourselves on this food now while we have the chance because we're traveling or we're at a party or we're hosting a friend, whatever the socially acceptable excuse feels like. We better gorge ourselves on this food now while we have the chance before we go back to our normal routine and lose access. If you're not usually allowing yourself to have certain foods, which could look like either not buying them, or if you do buy them, saying, oh, these are only for the kids, or this is only when company comes over, and kind of creating these restrictions around that food, it makes so much sense that you would feel out of control when you find yourself around those foods, such as, again, when traveling, babysitting, at a friend's house, at a holiday event, whatever it is, maybe in the office break room when donuts are brought in, whatever it is. This is because your brain is like, oh my God, we never get this. Here it is. We got to go to town on it now because we don't know if we're going to get this again. So it is so valid. This is why it's happening. Your brain is feeling this Last Supper mentality. And I think about buffets or like experiences like all you can eat resorts or cruises or something like this where there's an abundance of options. Maybe you're not used to that kind of freedom and abundance in daily life. Perhaps your daily life consists of more restriction, whether that's related to food access or time to cook and prepare, or restriction because of food rules. And then this can lead to overexcitement when we are around these abundance of options. And when we feel overexcited on trips or again, when traveling or whatever the thing is that puts us out of our normal routine, then what can happen is we can almost have like a planned binge where we're like, okay, I'm gonna go on this cruise, I'm really gonna eat, or I'm gonna go out to eat, and like I'm really gonna go to town here, or it's Thanksgiving and it's a birthday party, whatever it is. We can almost in our brain kind of set ourselves up to binge and be like, I know this is gonna happen. I'm just gonna like do it. For many people, food is a really exciting and therefore anticipated part of traveling. And this heightened excitement could lead to having trouble stopping when you get full, related to something called the sadness of saying enough. The sadness of saying enough is this phenomenon, this thing that happens when we're eating something that's really delicious and really pleasurable, and we start getting to that point where we're getting full. And the idea of stopping makes us sad because the experience has been so pleasurable and we don't want it to be over. And the saddest of saying enough comes from one of the co-authors of Intuitive Eating, Elise Resch, and she explains how this is valid. It's valid to feel sad and experience some grief when anything that's pleasurable in life is coming to an end, and an eating experience is no different. It's not dramatic to use the words grief when talking about mourning the end of an eating experience because it really can feel sad, and particularly, it can feel profoundly sad for someone with a history of disordered eating because it can feel like, oh no, like, is this my last chance at pleasure while eating? Am I going to have to go on another diet or restrict myself from eating the things I really want? Is that around the corner? Is that coming in the future? Because that's what your brain has known to happen historically when you've been chronically dieting or restricting. So, this heightened excitement going into a travel experience or an experience eating out at a restaurant or a holiday meal could lead to having trouble stopping when you get full because the heightened excitement can lead to heightened sadness when we start getting full and the eating experience is therefore coming to an end. The irony that I want to highlight for you here is if we want to keep eating because we were so excited about the pleasure of eating related to the travel experience or the holiday or whatever, but we start to become full to the point of it being uncomfortable, therefore no longer pleasurable. The irony is that our desire to continue eating is coming out of this place of wanting to continue to feel pleasure, yet we actually end up feeling uncomfortable and a lack of pleasure when we continue to eat because we start to feel sick or uncomfortable in our bodies. So I talk a lot more about the sadness of saying enough in this upcoming workshop, as I mentioned earlier in the episode, Overcoming Overeating. It's a really powerful way to think about how do you stop eating when the food just tastes so good and you don't want the experience to be over. I know it's so much easier said than done, but to start naming it, recognizing, okay, I think the sadness is saying enough might be at play right now, allowing yourself to sit with that emotion of sadness and seeing if it passes in time is a really great place to start. So we just spoke about why this is happening, and it really is coming down to this Last Supper mentality, this experience of restriction versus abundance, and it could even be subconscious or like deeply internalized and not even in your awareness that you're restricting. But if you're someone who has a history in diet culture, it's likely that this is at play, which is leading to this feeling of needing to capitalize on the special experience as a socially acceptable excuse to eat the things you really want. Again, there could be a lot of things happening, but overall, in my work with clients, this is what I see as the main reason why you find yourself overeating when traveling. So, before we go into my main tip for stopping overeating when traveling, I'll share a little bit more about my story with eating past comfortable fullness when doing things off my normal routines, such as traveling. So I mentioned babysitting earlier, and back when I was on Instagram, I did a post about this, and a bunch of people were like, "Whoa, I thought I was the only one who struggled with binge eating when babysitting." But you're not alone. And so I want to talk a little bit about babysitting first. Though babysitting isn't traveling, it's still doing something that puts you in somebody else's space, which could be similar to traveling or even similar to being hosted by a friend or something like this. So for me, babysitting was a job that I had in high school. What would happen is I was dieting, not actually even dieting at the time. I thought I was like being healthy. You can listen to my whole story episode to see what my relationship with food was like in high school. But essentially, I was in the diet mentality. I was like, I'm only eating clean foods, like healthy, unprocessed, all of that. That was the kind of flavor of diet culture that I got sucked into. And then I would be babysitting, and inevitably, a lot of the houses I would babysit at would have like all the fun kid snacks and like the gummies and the chips and the cookies and whatever. And I would find those foods irresistible because in my day-to-day life, I wasn't allowing those things. I was only allowing quote unquote whole unprocessed foods. And so when I was around those foods, my brain would do the thing that I mentioned earlier, which was like, we got to get this now. She never lets us have this. We got to capitalize on this experience while we have the access right now. And when the kids would go to bed or when they'd be like watching a show on the couch, I would find myself like sneaking into the kitchens of these families, feeling out of control and eating the kid snacks or like the adult snacks, whatever like the foods were. And I had a lot of shame around that. And I didn't really understand why that was happening. Fast forward all these years later, as an intuitive eating dietitian, it makes perfect sense to me why that was happening, as we've just talked through. And then, of course, I also experienced feeling out of control around food and overeating when going to friends' houses. Often growing up on like a Friday night, we'd go to a friend's house and I would wonder, like, how is my friend so chill around the chips or the cookies or the pizza or whatever it was? Meanwhile, I'm over here feeling like I can't get enough. Like it felt so exciting. And again, looking back, that makes sense to me because I didn't allow those things in my day-to-day life. And so my brain was like, this is our chance. This like Friday night friend hang this is our only chance to ever have pizza. And then when we go home, we're going to be good again and we're not going to do that. Meanwhile, my friend in this hypothetical story, which isn't really hypothetical, it's actually a true story, was habituated to those foods. Like she would allow cookies, candy, whatever, chips, pizza. all the time in her day-to-day life, so it wasn't such a big deal to her. It was something she could just take or leave. And when it comes to traveling, I definitely, when traveling, would just feel like, ugh, I don't even know, like I can't be good, so I'm just gonna say screw it and eat whatever, and that would lead me to feel really uncomfortable and not present when traveling, and it wasn't a nice way to be experiencing new places or visiting loved ones because it was really difficult to enjoy the experience and I was feeling so kind of yucky in my body the whole trip, really resonating with my client R, who I shared that story in the beginning of this episode, where she was like, "Ugh, I just feel so gross by the end of this trip because I have no sense of how to eat in a way that feels comfortable when out of my normal routine when I'm traveling." So that's a little bit about my story. I could go on and share more. If you're interested in hearing more of like my whole story of my relationship with food and body, I will link to an episode in the show notes about my story. Moving on to how do we stop this? We've outlined why it's happening, why overeating is so common when we're out of our normal routines or traveling, and I shared a little bit about my story. Now we're going to talk about how can we stop this from happening because it sucks. I first want to say it's easier said than done, right? Like maybe you've come home from a trip feeling so gross, pledging to never eat to that level of discomfort again. But then the next trip comes and you find yourself in the same position, leaving the trip on the plane home, just like, oh, I feel so sick from all that overeating while traveling. Stopping overeating when traveling slash off your normal routine actually starts when you're not traveling slash when you're in your daily routine. Working on taking food off of a pedestal and habituating to the types of foods that you find yourself binging on when traveling will help you feel more in control when you're around those foods on trips or at other people's houses or at special events. Your brain won't feel frenzied like this is your last chance or your only chance to get that food because it'll know, oh, that food is always available. So, my number one tip for you to stop feeling out of control around food when you're traveling is that you need to give yourself unconditional permission to eat all the time, not just when there's a special event or a special occasion like a vacation or a visit. This way, when the special event comes around, like the holiday or the trip, you won't feel this desperate need to capitalize on the event as your excuse to get your fill of pleasurable food, because you'll be having plenty of hits of pleasurable food throughout your day-to-day life. So there won't be this like heightened pressure of this is my chance to enjoy food and enjoy eating. And then when I get home, back to bland chicken, broccoli, rice, and diet town. So, what I want you to do, if you're listening to this episode and resonating this far, list out the types of foods that you're binging on when you travel or when you're at special events or when you're doing anything off your normal routine. Is it sweets? If so, what kind? Is it cookies, ice cream, cake, chocolate? Then I want you to pick one of the items on this list. So, say you have a list of like, I don't know, 5 different foods or food groups that you find yourself feeling out of control around when traveling. Maybe that list is something like French fries, ice cream, maybe there's candy, or maybe there's chips. I don't know, just a random list off the top of my head. I want you to look at that list and order it from the items that are the most triggering, the ones that you feel the most out of control around, all the way down to the items that you feel are triggering, but not as triggering, maybe like the least activating ones. What you're going to do is you're going to start with the ones that are the least activating. So maybe say ice cream is at the bottom of your list. Maybe you're like, all right, I feel out of control around ice cream, but it's not the thing that I feel the most out of control around. So, what I recommend doing is something called a controlled habituation experiment. This is something I do with all of my one-to-one clients. If they're a person who feels out of control around a certain food or food group or swears that they can't be around that food without going bananas, then I do this experiment with them. So say it's ice cream. What I want you to do is go to the store and buy an abundance of ice cream. But here's the important thing. I want you to pick one brand and one flavor. So maybe it's like Ben and Jerry's Cherry Garcia. That's my favorite flavor. Go to the store and buy a few pints of this flavor, maybe like 4 or 5, whatever you need to do to feel abundant. And you might be saying, oh my God, if I had that many pints in the freezer, I would go crazy. I would eat all of them. I would feel so sick. That might be true for the first, I don't know, day or two of the experiment. But how long do you think it would take you to feel like, I'm kind of over this. I'm actually craving something else now. You might be listening to this being like, Leah, I could never get to that point. Well, let me tell you something. I have worked with dozens of human beings, close to 100 human beings on their relationship with food and body. I have never worked with someone who never got to the place of habituation. Everyone I've worked with has eventually been like, oh, that food that was so triggering to me, I could take it or leave it now as a result of doing this experiment. So know that this is the long game. Yes, you might end up eating more ice cream in the short term, but in the long term, you're going to habituate to it. It's going to get that food off the pedestal and help you see, like, this is just ice cream. I could take it or leave it. A few specific tips with habituation. Make sure you're eating enough throughout the day when you do your habituation experiment so that you're not biologically hungry, like getting all your fuel from the food that you're habituating to. We want to make sure that you're baseline nourished going into this. Also, try not to do this experiment on a particularly stressful day or week because that can inhibit the habituation effect. I know everyday life can be quite stressful, but if you can pick a time that is maybe a little bit less stressful, that would really be helpful for this. And also remember to do this one item, one brand, one flavor at a time. Because if you have, say, you're doing this with cookies and you have peanut butter cookies, you have chocolate chip cookies, you have M&M cookies, the variety in cookies will impede the habituation effect. It's not that you can't habituate to food that way, but it will take a little longer because every time you switch between cookie flavor, it's a little novel. And so it's going to take longer to get to that place of habituation with the food because you have more variety in the mix. Those are my tips for doing a controlled habituation experiment. And then once you get to that place with ice cream, you can move to the next one on your list. Okay, now maybe it's chicken nuggets. And you're like, all right, let's do this. Let's buy a bunch of chicken nuggets, frozen chicken nuggets, or whatever kind you want to buy. And let's give ourselves unconditional permission to eat these until we genuinely get to the place of like, I could take it or leave it. And you keep going that way so that when the special event comes along, or when you're traveling, or when you're, I don't know, at a birthday party or babysitting or whatever it is, your brain doesn't feel like we have to capitalize on this opportunity to get all these foods we're not usually allowed to have because you're like, yeah, I have had ice cream sitting in my freezer for months. I could take it or leave it. That's okay. I have had access to chicken nuggets for a long time. This wedding isn't the only chance to eat these chicken nuggets right now. I don't know. People are serving chicken nuggets, maybe at like a cocktail hour or something at a wedding. Honestly, that sounds like a fun thing to serve at a wedding to me. But anyway, that's a side note. So to summarize, the main reason why you're likely feeling out of control around food when traveling or babysitting or going to a friend or family member's house or doing whatever it is that is off your normal routine is because of the Last Supper mentality and because of the feeling that this is your only chance to have the foods you really want to be having. So, the main tip that I have for you is to work on habituating to those foods in regular everyday life, allowing them on a random Tuesday or in the middle of the day or whatever it is, so that you don't have this heightened pressure where your only chance to get those foods feels like it has to be at these like special events or these times when you're doing something out of your normal routine. I hope this was helpful for you, and I hope that you'll join us for the Overcoming Overeating workshop, where we're going to be diving even deeper into how to move past overeating, how to conquer nighttime snacking, emotional eating, and break the binge restrict cycle. You can head to the link in the show notes to enroll in that workshop. Again, it's only $10, which is literally such a steal. I wanted to make it super accessible. It's only $10 when you use the code podcast at checkout. The workshop is going to be held on October 22nd at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. But if you can't attend live, you can still enroll and you'll get the recording after the workshop is over. If you have any questions at all, you can email me at leah@leahkernrd.com and I'd love to chat. I hope this episode was supportive for you. Thanks so much for being here, and I'll talk to you in our next episode.